Watch. And look, I'm afraid I have to talk about the ABC again because the ABC keeps making the same grotesque errors, like it's beyond all normal journalistic standards. I have to say, to me, it's global warming propaganda now comes too close for comfort to outright deception. And we saw that again last night in two of the national broadcasters' biggest shows, most high-profile ones. Last week, I said that Media Watch host Paul Barry showed appalling ignorance when he attacked a sceptic, Professor Ian Plimer.
Denial is what News Corp's campaign against the facts and the experts on climate change amounts to. And 2 days after Rupert spoke came another example from Ian Plimer in The Australian, urging us not to pollute minds with carbon fears, telling us
there are no carbon emissions. If there were, we could not see because most carbon is black.
Now, as I pointed out here, Plimer was right and Paul Barry completely wrong because carbon emissions do not cause global warming. It's carbon dioxide emissions we're talking about, just like your breath. As you can see, it's a gas and it's invisible, not black. But last night, watch now the deceptive way that Paul Barry doubled down on his howler.
a blistering attack on this op-ed in The Australian, which we had a swipe at last week.
Let's not pollute minds with carbon fears.
In which geologist Ian Plimer assured readers
there are no carbon emissions. If there were, we could not see because most carbon is black.
The website Climate Feedback asked 10 climate scientists in Australia, Britain, the US and Germany to review the Plimer piece, and we reckon they scored it around 1 out of 10. In their words,
a majority of reviewers tagged the article as biased,
flawed reasoning,
inaccurate,
misleading.
Now, that is the only Plimer claim that Paul Barry really singled out and quoted in that piece. And a casual viewer would then assume that these 10 experts had claimed that Plimer was wrong about these carbon emissions, whether they're black or whatever, or whether he should have been talking about, whether Paul Barry should have been talking about carbon dioxide emissions. Well, if they had that impression, Paul Barry fooled them because it is absolutely false. I've gone to that climate feedback site. Not one of the 10 scientists say that Plimer was wrong about that carbon emissions quote. Yes, one said it was laughable as a counter-argument to his wider thesis, but not one said it was inaccurate. And note this too, on Media Watch last night, Paul Barry quoted all these alarmists abusing Plimer. He loved that bit, but he did not give a single example of Plimer actually making a mistake. It was all abuse, no proof, which is the way these days. It's not about truth. Then, as if that's not bad enough, on the very next ABC show last night, Q&A went on and on about a global warming scare that is clearly, patently, obviously, scientifically false.
If we didn't work hard, if the world didn't reduce emissions as called for the IPCC special report to reduce significantly greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, we will face the situation where island countries like Tuvalu, Kiribati and Marshall Islands and others be submerged into the sea by 2060.
Now that claim that islands like Tuvalu, Kiribati and the Marshalls are drowning, that claim is so false that even the ABC's own fact-check unit was last year forced to admit that Tuvalu had not drowned but instead grown over the last 40 years by 2.9%. And Kiribati, its main island, South Tarawa, has also increased, says another very substantial survey. As for the Marshalls, two of its main islands, the two examined by scientists, have grown since World War II. In fact, an authoritative Auckland University study says that for every one Pacific island that's getting smaller, 3 others are getting bigger, and 3 more are staying the same. Now, this has been pointed out so often to the ABC. I've even told its managing director this, personally. Yet again and again, the ABC repeats this falsehood. Pacific Islands are sinking. False. Joining me on Newswatch is Gerard Henderson, head of the Sydney Institute, columnist with the Australian newspaper and author of the Media Watchdog blog. Gerard, thank you so much indeed for your time again. The ABC's Paul Barry, right, caught out once last week, doubles down this week by giving the totally false impression that 10 scientists agreed with him. Now, how can someone get away with that on the ABC?
Well, you get away with anything you like on the ABC, by and large, if you're on the left. Look, I don't think it's deceit. I think Paul Barry believes what he wants to believe. What I am surprised about is how clumsy he was last night, because he has a total staff of 8. I think 6 of them are full-time, 2 of them are part-time, and that's in addition to himself. So that's sort of an effective full-time staff of around 8, and they couldn't even work out that the point that they were criticising Ian Plimer about was the point where he was accurate, that he was talking about climate carbon dioxide, and the allegation suggested he was talking about carbon. So it was very clumsy. You think if you've got 8 researchers, someone ought to be able to pick that up, but mistakes go through. I think it's probably because he believes what he wants to believe, and in this he's a kind of warrior in this debate. And the problem is, as I've said on this program on many occasions, the problem is, unlike Fox News, Rupert Murdoch's Fox News, where you actually have debates among journalists and commentators on Fox News in the United States, there is no debate on Media Watch. No one with a contrary opinion is allowed on the program, during the program, or after the program, say the following week. So all debate is shut down, and Paul Barry just preaches like an old-fashioned religious leader. He just preaches his belief.
Yes, come to Green Jesus, come to Greta Thunberg. Look, if anyone's interested in this, because there is much more to say about what Paul Barry did last night and the paper that he relied on, the errors in that one as well, in trying to ping Ian Plimer, go to my blog. I've done a very long post just spelling it out, because this really needs to be called out. It's so shameful. But then you mentioned there, Gerard, about the lack of debate, and I think this is really crucial here, because people, it's very hard for the ABC to realise it's in the bubble and to have someone on board to criticise, to point out where they go wrong. Q&A last night, exactly this problem. No one on the panel, and certainly not host Tony Jones, who's real warmest, corrected that false claim that Pacific Islands like Kiribati, Tuvalu, Marshalls were drowning rather than, in fact, growing. Shouldn't one of the panellists at least, well, I would have thought Australia's Minister for International Development of the Pacific, Alex Hawke, he was there, shouldn't he have pointed out the real science, or did people get intimidated by the mob?
Well, as I was watching him, look, for starters, I don't think he should have got on the program. I think it's unwise for any senior government minister to go on a program like that, because you get ambushed. But as I recall watching the program, he wasn't invited in at that stage, so he would have had to inject his way in. And then it's very difficult for a senior minister in the Australian government to be having a public row with the former Prime Minister of one of the nations in the region. So he was on a hiding to nothing. And no one else came in. And, I mean, in this sense here, it's really up to the presenter. If someone says something that's false, and Tony Jones is always calling on people, if you find an error on the program, to get in touch. But when an error is made on the program, he doesn't attempt to correct it. He doesn't even attempt to challenge the person to present evidence in support of the position. So it then becomes, it's not really a discussion at all. Now, I understand Mr Hawke's problem, but I would have thought, if any senior cabinet ministers are looking at the performance last night, and to be fair to Q&A, it was the last program put together by its left-wing executive producer Peter McAvoy, and it may or may not change next year. But if anyone's watching that, I mean, the warning is don't go on, because you get ambushed. It's really sort of, last night it was sort of 4 against 1. Possibly 5 against 1.
Yeah, but he did make a stand. Look, if I was there, I would have pointed it out. And you would think that the Minister for the Pacific kind of understands what's really going on in the Pacific, and that is global warming that is not causing those islands to drown. They're gathering coral and and debris from the oceans and all that, they're growing, most of them. 86% of those islands are growing or stable. I don't know why the government doesn't say it. And also, they could point out that there's a reason that these island nations are blaming the West for the emissions that might doom their island, and it's called money. Money. Anyway,
Yes,
I just want to ask you, Gerard, the stack of the panel, there's actually one more Q&A. That's next week, the last one of the year, the last one by regular host Tony Jones before he sails off to the bosom of the Communist Party up in Beijing with his wife, the ABC correspondent there. Cop this for bias, Gerard. The panel next week will be entirely of the cultural left, and I include, from the left there, former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, now a global warming crusader, enemy of the Morrison Liberal government, Labor leader Anthony Albanese, ditto, Sisonkai Missimong, who writes on feminism and race, Pat Turner, Aboriginal activist, and astrophysicist Brian Schmidt, another global warming crusader. How do you sum up that panel, Gerard? He says, is bowling down a long hop at very slow speed to an informed batsman.
Well, I think it's the kind of panel you get when you have a Conservative free zone. Now, to be fair to Tony Jones, the panel would have been essentially chosen by the executive producer. They choose the panels at the ABC, not the presenters, as I understand it. But it's just another stack. I'm looking forward to it. I'm hoping that Malcolm Turnbull may dust off that old leather jacket that he hasn't worn on Q&A for a while and get back into it. But I think we might expect, if we look at some of Mr Turnbull's recent statements, I think we should expect some serious criticism of the coalition government, in which case it would probably be a situation where, again, it was very familiar on so many ABC programmes, where everyone agrees with everyone else on everything in a left-of-centre kind of way, and no Conservatives are really invited. And if a Conservative gets on, it's probably because they were looking for the pub and walked into the ABC studio by mistake. But your chances of getting on and that kind of panel are not good. So I think the Q&A will end up next week the way it's pretty well run all the year.
You know exactly. I can hear this coming down the corridor a mile.
Free zone.
Yeah. The Morrison government is just a shocker, and it should do more about global warming. So says Turnbull and every other person on the panel. I can guarantee I could write the script right now. To Channel 9, though, in 60 Minutes, Gerard, a week ago it had this bombshell that China's President Xi Jinping will be rocked by news of a senior Chinese spy wanting to defect to Australia. Have a listen.
A Chinese spy, one of his own people, is betraying him, breaking ranks and defecting to the West. Australia, to be more specific. Tonight, China's dirty secrets will be revealed by a very brave man who's now placed a very big target on himself. And be in no doubt, what Wang Liqiang is doing is so dangerous, speaking publicly is probably the only way to save his life.
Is it right what you're saying? Your job was to meddle in Taiwan's upcoming presidential election secretly for the Chinese government?
Yes, that's why I needed to change my name and not use my true identity.
Gerard, how's that story of a master spy operating in Taiwan and Hong Kong and now in Australia, how's that held up?
Well, I was very dubious about it. That's why I didn't make any comment on it. It hasn't held up well. I think the problem with so much of modern journalism is that so many journalists believe what people tell them without querying. And the word seems to be, as reported in the Australian, the Daily Telegraph and some other News Corp publications, that senior figures in the Australian intelligence community feel there are certain problems in Mr Wang's story. Now, what I found disturbing about the interview was that he wasn't really challenged and everything he said was accepted. But I know many cases in Australian journalism in recent times where if you want to believe something, you believe everything what someone tells you, and you don't go and check it. And I think that's the problem. It went to air too early. It should have been further investigated, and it will have serious implications, possibly. Look, I've been a critic of the Chinese Communist Party for over half a century. I've been a critic since the 1960s. I'm not an apologist for China in any way, but I do have concerns about exaggerations, and they don't do anyone any good. So I still reserve my position, but I wasn't convinced by what I heard. But what surprised me was the journalist involved was completely convinced, and I found that that disturbing. This is 9 newspapers production now. Channel 9, 60 Minutes is part of 9 newspapers, and this is one of 9 newspapers' leading journalist, and it seemed to me that he was very gullible, and that's not the role of journalism. The role of journalism and commentary is to query, is to challenge, is to ask questions. It's not to accept what everyone tells you. Now, it may be that Mr. Wong is some form of low-level intelligence operative. It may be he's not an operative at all. It's too early to judge, but certainly the story so far doesn't stack up, and to start with, it seemed quite extraordinary. The allegations were made by a man who is so young, who's under 30 years old, seemed to be quite extraordinary allegations.
Look, and it was like Zelig-like. He was on the scene of everything, which I thought that did ring untrue. And like you, if this is wrong and it doesn't smell right, and obviously the guy clearly wants to stay here, and the more he talks, the less possible it is to send him back to China. But the point is, that doesn't mean that China is suddenly, hard put on. We're being too tough on it. It's doing plenty to criticise. This one story, that's got whiskers on it. Gerard Henderson, thank you so much indeed for your time.
Pleasure.